I stood there, my back aching from the broom strike Sophie had delivered. My daughter-in-law, the woman I once welcomed into my home. Tea spilled across the floor, but it wasn't just the tea that was ruined. Kyle, my own son, didn't speak, didn't defend me. I wasn't just hurt by the strike, but by their silence. And as I reached for the will, I knew this. The only thing I could control now was who stayed in my life and who didn't. Sophie's name would be the first to go. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The porcelain cup slipped an inch as Dolores's hand gave a soft twitch. Not a full shake, not even enough to warrant concern. Just the kind of fleeting tremor arthritis gives you when you're 73, tired, and trying to be careful. The tea splashed, warm and golden, across the antique tile in the Manning kitchen. A small puddle bloomed at Sophie's feet. The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Dolores straightened slowly, reaching for a paper towel. Sorry, Han. Seriously? Again? Sophie's tone could have curdled cream. Her stiletto heels snapped backward across the tile, then forward again. Dolores turned, towel in hand, and caught the full bristle of a kitchen broom across her back. It wasn't playful. It wasn't an accident. It was swift, firm, and loud enough to echo. Sophie's eyes were wild, her mouth curled in disgust. You're always making a mess. It's like babysitting with wrinkles. She dropped the broom against the counter with a clatter, as though it had done the crime. Dolores didn't cry out. She didn't even bend. She stood as tall as 73 and a fresh bruise would allow. Her breath shook once in her chest. She looked toward the living room. Kyle was on the couch, still, phone in hand. He blinked once, looked between the two women, then lowered his eyes like they held answers he didn't want to read. Sophie brushed past Dolores as if the incident were a commercial break in her day. Next time, use a tray, or just don't bother. I'll make my own. The broom was upright again in the corner by the pantry before Dolores could find her breath. Dolores placed the used towel over the spill, moving with quiet, measured hands. Her back throbbed beneath the fabric of her cotton blouse. She hadn't been struck since she was a girl, and even then, only by consequence, never cruelty. Outside, the Georgia humidity draped over the porch like a heavy quilt. The scent of jasmine from the garden clung to the screen door as Tamara arrived, unannounced and early for their weekly walk. Dolores answered the knock like nothing was wrong, but as she stepped forward, her body stiffened. Tamara's eyes narrowed. What happened? Dropped a cup. Sophie got upset, Dolores said quietly, turning to get her walking cane from the hook by the door. Tamara caught the movement. Her nurse instincts flared before her mouth even opened. Wait, stop right there. She gently turned Dolores by the elbow. The shirt lifted just enough to reveal the faint beginning of a bruise, long, horizontal, and angry. That's no tea spill, Dee. Tamara's voice dropped to a low, flat tone. That's assault. Dolores said nothing. Her hands folded in front of her like she was praying with silence. You need to tell Kyle. He was here, Dolores murmured. He didn't say a word. Tamara exhaled hard. Her jaw clenched. Then you need to tell someone who will. Dolores nodded once, the movement slow and deliberate. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply looked at the porch swing, and then down at her hands. That evening, after Tamara left, and the house was again filled with the sharp-edged clatter of Sophie's dinner prep, Dolores stood before the mirror in her bedroom. She turned slightly, inspecting the bruise as it bloomed into a purple shadow. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, reached into the nightstand drawer, and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. She wrote a neat, deliberate cursive, May 2nd, 2:16 p.m. Sophie struck me with a broom after a tea spill. Kyle witnessed. No defense. Pain 5 out of 10. No apology. No care. She closed the notebook, locked it back in the drawer. And for the first time in a long time, she let the ache in her spine speak louder than the one in her heart. Dolores waited until Sophie left for her ladies' yoga class to speak. The house was quieter then, save for the hum of the dishwasher and the tired spin of the ceiling fan in the den. Kyle was settled into his recliner, flipping absently through the sports channel, beer in hand, socks mismatched. She stood near the armrest, arms crossed in front of her cotton blouse. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "You saw it, Kyle." His jaw tightened as he swallowed, eyes still on the screen. "She didn't mean it like that." "Like what exactly?" Dolores asked. Her hands were trembling now, not from weakness but restraint. Kyle finally turned, meeting her eyes just long enough to fumble out a rehearsed half-excuse. She was just frustrated. It wasn't that serious. She didn't hit you to hurt you." Dolores inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. She left a bruise. "On my back." "It's just, she's under pressure," he mumbled. "The brunch coming up, her boutique, the house always being busy. You know how she gets." "She hit me with a broom," Dolores said, each word like a nail in wood. "I'm not part of her boutique inventory. I'm your mother." Before Kyle could answer, Sophie's voice floated into the room like smoke through a cracked door. "Are we still talking about the tea thing?" She entered with a bounce in her step, all sunny grin and sarcastic charm. "Let's all calm down. No drama, okay? Accidents happen." Dolores stared at her, expression unreadable. Sophie leaned on the doorway like it was all a game, flicking a manicured nail against her phone screen. "You know, this vibe is a little much. Let's not turn spilled tea into some kind of family trauma, Kyle stood up slowly, shifting awkwardly toward the hallway. "I think I'm going to take a shower." "Yeah," Sophie called after him with a scoff. "Go rinse off whatever guilt is brewing in here." Dolores waited until the door shut behind them both. Then, with steady steps, she returned to her room and opened her nightstand. She pulled out the same leather-bound notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and began writing. May 3rd, 10:42 a.m. Kyle witnessed assault, denied seriousness. Sophie dismissed incident again. No apology, reiterated blame, no remorse. Pain 6 out of 10. Spine bruising worsening. She paused, pen hovering, then added in smaller handwriting beneath. He didn't raise a hand, but he lowered his eyes. Later that afternoon, Tamara sat across from Dolores at the kitchen table, sipping iced tea and inspecting the bruise now the color of eggplant. The ceiling fan above clicked every few seconds, rhythmic, almost accusatory. "She's got gall, that one," Tamara muttered. "And Kyle, he needs a backbone transplant." Dolores didn't respond. She handed Tamara the notebook instead. Tamara flipped through a few pages and nodded, her mouth pulling into a tight line. "Start stacking receipts, honey. Not groceries, evidence." Dolores pressed her lips together, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. That evening, long after Sophie had gone to bed and Kyle had fallen asleep watching some rerun comedy he wasn't really laughing at, Dolores stood by the front window in her robe. Crickets whispered outside. The street lamp made long shadows across the hardwood floor. She watched as Kyle crept out to the curb in nothing but pajama pants and an old college hoodie. In his hands, the broom. He placed it beside the trash can, not in it. Then stood for a second, staring down like he didn't quite know what he was doing. Dolores didn't move, didn't tap on the glass, just watched. Once he disappeared back inside, she walked to the hallway closet and knelt before the built-in safe. Her fingers spun the dial with quiet precision, muscle memory sharp as ever. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a pale blue scarf, was a manila folder marked Last Will and Testament, 2015. She pulled it out slowly, as if unearthing something sacred. Then sat at her desk, turned on the reading lamp, and began flipping through the pages. Sophie's name stared back at her. Right next to Kyle's. Equal shares, equal rights. Dolores stared at it like a stain that wouldn't come out. She uncapped her red pen, Dolores sat at her writing desk beneath the front window, golden late afternoon light brushing over her shoulders. The folder lay open, her will spread out like a confession. She ran her fingers down the neatly typed lines, stopping at the paragraph that split her estate equally between my son Kyle Manning and his wife, Sophie Manning. Her eyes narrowed. The ink was too neat, too generous. She thought of the way Sophie had looked down at her after the Broom connected. Eyes hard, smile thin. That flick of the wrist, the crack of wood on bone, and Kyle's silence behind it. Dolores reached for her pen and drew a bold red underline beneath Sophie's name, slowly, deliberately. Then in the margin, she wrote 2 words, remove entirely. A hummingbird buzzed outside the window, dipping into her hanging basket of petunias. She didn't flinch, just folded the will closed and dialed Harold Stokes. Harold, it's Dolores. We need to revise a few things, privately. There was a pause on the other end, long enough to imply understanding. I'll clear my schedule, Harold said. Tuesday, 11 a.m. Dolores hung up, exhaling like she'd just put down a weight. But it wasn't relief. It was resolve. By the time Tuesday arrived, she had the folder packed, her notebook updated, and a fresh blouse buttoned up to the collar. Tamara pulled into the driveway at 10:15 sharp in her cherry red sedan, sunglasses already on and windows down. Ready to erase that witch? She asked, popping the trunk. Dolores gave a half smile as she climbed in. Let's drive. As they moved through the slow, humid streets of Savannah, Dolores kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Not for traffic, for taillights. Just making sure Sophie didn't decide to follow. Tamara let out a bark of a laugh. If she did, she'd catch more than tea this time. I keep a crowbar in the trunk. Harold's office was tucked between a bookshop and a frame store. Old brick. No nonsense. Just like him. He greeted Dolores with a nod and a quiet, "Come in." Door closes behind you. Inside, he motioned toward a wide oak table where Dolores laid out the original documents. I've reviewed your file since our last update, he said. You want to disinherit Sophie? Dolores looked him dead in the eye. I won't leave my name in her mouth. Or hers in my money. Harold didn't blink. Understood. He slid on his glasses and scanned the will. We'll start by removing her from joint inheritance, then restructure Kyle's portion with stipulations. Do you want it conditional? Yes, Dolores replied. He gets it if, and only if, he doesn't try to redirect any of it to her. We'll need that in writing, witnessed and signed. Harold scribbled a note. Do you want to redirect Sophie's share elsewhere? I do. Set aside a portion for the trade school's culinary program, and another for a local shelter, one for women who don't have the luxury of a locked door. Harold paused. That's bold. Dolores. It's personal, she said. He nodded again, typing steadily. After the legal forms were in motion, Harold frowned slightly, flipping through one of the financial summaries Dolores had brought. This account, did you authorize Sophie to have access to this one? Dolores leaned forward, brow furrowing. That's supposed to be for household repairs only. Last I saw, it had just under $15,000. Harold turned the screen toward her. It's down to $5,470. Dolores blinked. What? He scrolled. Over 30 small withdrawals in the last 4 months, most tagged to online merchant IDs and a shop called Maison Lily. Tamara leaned in. Isn't that her boutique? The one with overpriced napkin rings? Dolores didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the most recent charge. A $1,200 order dated last week, while Dolores had been bruised and icing her back in bed. Harold looked up. We'll freeze this. Today. Dolores didn't nod, didn't speak. Her hand moved slowly back to her notebook. She uncapped her pen, turned to a new page, and underlined a different name this time. Sophie's boutique, her theft. No more accidents, no more tolerance. The numbers didn't lie, but the betrayal still stung like a slap across the face. Harold slid the printed bank statement across the table. $9,316, he said, tapping the page with a blunt fingertip. All transferred out over 4 months, different vendors, same card. Dolores leaned in slowly, her glasses perched low on her nose. She scanned each line: Maison Lily, Pure Coterie, Southern Sipware. One after another, boutique purchases and luxury house goods. "Did you approve these charges?" Harold asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Dolores said firmly. "I haven't bought anything except arthritis cream and green beans since Easter." Harold adjusted his tie, serious now. Kyle added Sophie as an authorized user through his own access. "Your son was listed for emergency errands. I have that in your original form. But this," he tapped again, "this is no emergency." Dolores let out a breath like she'd been holding it in for years. She sat back in the chair, hands folded tightly, trying to keep her voice steady. "So I gave them a key to the pantry, and they cleaned out the whole kitchen." Harold nodded. Metaphor tracks. Tamara, seated near the window with arms crossed and eyes narrow, broke the silence. "What's the next step, Harold?" "We freeze this account before the week's out," he said. "I'll get paperwork started today. We'll lock them out of everything you don't explicitly approve. If Kyle or Sophie attempt a reversal, it'll flag fraud." Dolores didn't answer right away. She was staring at her hands, the calluses still visible after decades of holding skillets, frosting cakes, peeling peaches for pies. Hands that once kneaded dough now trembling at the thought of who she had trusted. Tamara gently nudged her elbow. "You gave them a loaf. They came back for the oven." Dolores stood. "Let's get this done." That night, she returned home just after 7. The lights were on in the kitchen, and laughter, Sophie's high, theatrical kind, echoed down the hallway. She stepped inside quietly. Boxes cluttered the counter, a copper saucepan set, a branded stand mixer she didn't recognize, and lined up like trophies, sleek pastel-colored utensils still in their packaging. Sophie turned, catching Dolores's eye. "Oh, good, you're back. Be careful. The new paring knives are ridiculously sharp." Dolores said nothing. She walked past, opened the fridge, pulled a glass of water, and drank it in silence. Sophie followed her. "So, we're hosting the Ladies of Legacy charity brunch on Sunday. They'll be expecting a southern spread, biscuits, shrimp, and grits, the works." She smiled as if she were offering an invitation. Dolores turned slowly. "Are you asking for help?" "Oh no," Sophie said, waving her hand. "You'll be cooking, just like always. Gotta earn your keep around here, right?" Dolores blinked, then smiled, not warm, not kind, just the smile a mother reserves when she's finally reached her line. Tamara's words echoed in her ear. Time to hit back, not with fists, with forms. She turned to leave the kitchen without another word, her water glass still half full in her hand. Upstairs, she opened the notebook beside her bed, wrote brunch request, 40 guests, underlined it twice, and then added, purchased new cookware same day as transfer notice. The smell of Sophie's expensive candles drifted through the vents. Lavender eucalyptus, synthetic and sweet. But Dolores smelled something else entirely. She smelled opportunity, and it was baking. The scent of bacon fat and toasted pecans drifted through the house like a hymn. Dolores had been up since 4:45 a.m., hands deep in biscuit dough, sweat running down her spine as the oven hissed behind her. Outside, the early Savannah heat clung to the windows. Inside, the heat came from the stove and from the weight of everything unspoken. The guest list had grown to 42, but Sophie insisted it would be simple. Dolores worked the kitchen like a battlefield. Cast iron in one hand, whisk in the other, wrist wrapped tight in a cooling sleeve from overuse. Every grit spooned, every sausage flipped, every quiche placed was done by her alone. Sophie only appeared to float in and out of the kitchen wearing linen and pearls, pretending to help. By noon, the guests had arrived. Well-dressed women from the Ladies of Legacy group, local shop owners, a few city council wives. Kyle, dressed in his only pressed shirt, stood in the corner holding a mimosa, nodding like a proud husband at Sophie's every exaggerated gesture. Our little secret ingredient, Sophie said, gesturing toward Dolores, who was wiping her brow. She just loves staying busy. A ripple of polite laughter traveled across the patio. Dolores didn't flinch. She adjusted her apron and returned inside, where her final tray of honey-glazed ham biscuits waited, steam curling upward like a signal. She had prepared 6 sets of folded napkins with small notes tucked beneath the silverware, handwritten, simple, no drama. Dolores Manning, assaulted in her own kitchen. Financial theft documented. Photos available. Please contact Harold Stokes, Esquire. She placed the napkins with precision, only at settings for the women she trusted, the ones she'd known for years, the ones who didn't just sip gossip but stirred the truth. The 6th place card read, Retired, Judge Arliss Duval. When she returned to the patio, Sophie was mid-toast. Kyle's mother is the heart of our household, she gushed, fingers brushing Dolores's shoulder. She's taught me everything I know. Kyle chimed in, drunk on flattery. Wouldn't be a brunch without Mama's hands. Dolores stood silently, smiling only with her eyes, watching as Sophie soaked in praise she hadn't earned. As plates were passed, guests murmured about the cornbread texture, the balance of the cheese grits, the delicate pecan tartlets. Sophie performed like a debutante, waving compliments off with false humility. But 6 women, one by one, paused when they unfolded their napkins. They read, then glanced up at Dolores. Judge Duval was the last to receive hers. She opened the note quietly, eyes narrowed. She didn't react, didn't blink, just folded the napkin again, placed it in her clutch, and returned to her shrimp and grits without a word. By 2 p.m., the event wound down. Sophie air-kissed cheeks and posed for photos. Kyle stacked chairs. Dolores stood alone in the kitchen, hands raw and trembling, the grease in her apron soaked through. You're a star, Sophie said, leaning in. Don't forget to wipe down the counters before you rest. Dolores turned, wiped her hands on a towel, and said, I already did. That night, her legs throbbed. Tamara brought her Epsom salts and cracked open a peach soda. You pulled it off, Tamara said. I didn't cook for applause, Dolores replied. I cooked a warning. Across town, in an office lined with law books and quiet resolve, Judge Duval sat in her den. The note was pinned under her paperweight. She dialed the number listed and waited. Stokes Law, answered the receptionist. This is Judge Arliss Duval, she said calmly. Tell Harold I'd like a meeting regarding Dolores Manning. First thing tomorrow. The phone rang at 9:02 a.m., just as Harold Stokes was pouring his 2nd cup of black coffee. He didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end made him stand straighter in his chair. This is Judge Arliss Duval. I attended a brunch yesterday, where your client, Dolores Manning, served more than just food. Harold put down his mug, already sensing the weight in her tone. I believe she's being mistreated, Duval continued. I don't say that lightly, but I read what she placed in my napkin, and I want to help. Quietly, for now. Harold reached for his legal pad. Understood, Your Honor. We're already taking action. That same afternoon, Dolores walked into Harold's office wearing a floral blouse and quiet resolve. The air smelled of lemon-scented polish and dry paper. She clutched a worn folder with corners bent from years of storage. We're rewriting it, she said without sitting. Every line, every intention, Harold nodded. You're ready. Past ready. By the time Tamara arrived to pick her up an hour later, the new draft had been completed. Sophie Manning's name had been struck out with finality. Kyle's name remained, but with conditions. No inheritance unless he completed financial counseling. Signed a sworn affidavit of no abuse or neglect, and had no further contact with Sophie should Dolores be harmed or mistreated again. I'm not punishing him for marrying her, Dolores had told Harold. I'm holding him accountable for standing beside her while she put a bruise on my spine and a stain on my peace. The rest of the estate, redirected with grace and vengeance. A culinary scholarship would be established at the Savannah School of Trades, in Dolores's name. Her copper cookware, her grandmother's spice rack, her handwritten recipe cards, each tagged and boxed for donation to the program. My biscuits will outlive me, she smiled, even if my son's backbone won't. As they walked to Tamara's car, the sun cut shadows across the sidewalk, thick with Savannah humidity. Tamara fanned herself and opened the door. You just turned a bruise into a legacy, she said. She thought she broke you. You just broke ground. That night, the house was still. The air was heavy with leftovers and silence. Sophie was tapping through her phone at the table. Kyle scraped the last of the sweet potatoes onto his plate. Dolores stood to collect the dishes, out of habit. Hey, Dolores, Sophie said without looking up. Can you clean the stovetop too? It's greasy. And wipe the fridge. You spilled juice again this morning. Dolores paused. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply set the plate back down on the table and turned to face Sophie directly. I'm not your help. The room froze. Sophie blinked. Dolores reached for her handbag and keys. I cooked. I served. I cleaned. For 40 years. And I was glad to do it, for family. But I don't work for you, Sophie. And I don't take orders from someone who smacked me like a stray dog and smiled while doing it. Kyle opened his mouth, but Dolores didn't wait for the sound. She walked toward the front door, her heels tapping against the hardwood. The silence behind her was louder than any slap. Outside, the cicadas buzzed in the late heat, and somewhere down the block, Tamara's porch light flicked on early. Dolores walked toward it, shoulders square, the evening air brushing against her arms like freedom. She didn't hear the screen door creak behind her, but she didn't need to. She'd already closed the one that mattered. The wine glass clinked against the edge of the plate as Sophie tapped her fork against it. Sharp, high-pitched, and attention-seeking. Let's try again, she announced loudly from the head of the table. Can we all please act like adults tonight? The table was already cleared of food. Kyle sat beside her, sullen, his plate empty but untouched. Dolores's chair was still pushed back from the night before. She hadn't returned after walking out, and Sophie didn't like the optics. I mean, she stormed out like I asked her to scrub the floors with her eyelashes, Sophie said, half laughing. She's acting unstable, Kyle muttered, more to his phone than to anyone else. But someone was listening, Tamara on the other end of the line. Say that again, she asked, deadpan. Phone pressed to her cheek as she stood in her garden with pruning shears in one hand and her iPhone in the other. Unstable, you said. Kyle hesitated. You know what I mean. She's... He stopped. The silence made Tamara smile grimly. I sure do, she said, and tapped the red circle on her phone. The recording was saved. By morning, Dolores was already halfway through packing. Her photo albums, marriage certificate, her collection of Sunday hats, and the small jewelry box with a faded red ribbon went into labeled boxes. Not a word of the process was frantic. Every drawer opened with purpose. Every item handled with reverence. She didn't rush, but she didn't dawdle either. Take only what matters, Tamara said as she handed her a fresh box. Let her have the curtains and the crumbs. Dolores smiled faintly. I gave them a house. I'm leaving with peace. Tamara's guest room was small but freshly painted, with white lace curtains and lavender sachets tucked in the pillowcases. Dolores placed her suitcase at the foot of the bed and exhaled. It was the first time in weeks she'd slept with the door locked, and felt safe. Harold moved quickly. The following afternoon, he filed a legal declaration with the probate office. Dolores Manning's estate, financial accounts, and medical decisions were to remain solely under her control. He included notarized statements, receipts, and her updated will, signed, witnessed, and sealed. They'll sniff around, Harold warned, so we give them a wall to run into. And sniff they did. By the end of the week, Sophie was on her second lap around the neighborhood, stopping at every neighbor's porch swing. She's not well, she whispered dramatically. Keeps forgetting things. Left the stove on last month. Walked into traffic. Most neighbors nodded politely. A few offered concerned looks. One asked, "Didn't she just host that scholarship brunch?" Sophie waved it off. "Stress brings on decline fast. We just want what's best for her." But her campaign stalled faster than she expected. Savannah was a town where gossip traveled faster than good news, and even quicker than lies were the faces of those who remembered Dolores bringing them casseroles during chemo, or cupcakes to PTA meetings, or comfort when no one else did. Still, Sophie had a card left to play. It came in the form of a crisp white envelope, hand-delivered by courier. Tamara opened the door just as Dolores was sipping her afternoon tea on the porch. The moment she saw the seal, legal, cold, and uninvited, Dolores straightened in her chair. "Court papers," Tamara muttered, reading the top. "She's petitioning for power of attorney." Dolores didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or protest. She calmly took the envelope, turned it over, and ran her fingers along the edge like she was checking a pie crust for doneness. "She wants power," she said, voice low. Tamara's gaze narrowed. She just grabbed a live wire. Dolores nodded once, then stood. "Then let's remind her who owns the grid." The courtroom air was cold, the kind that settled into your shoulders and made you sit straighter. Dolores Manning stepped inside, wearing pale blue linen and dignity like armor. Harold walked beside her, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed to the zipper. Sophie was already seated, back straight, lips pressed into a permanent smirk. Kyle sat beside her, eyes flicking nervously between his wife and his mother like he was caught between two storms, and praying neither one turned his way. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Arliss Duval entered, stone-faced, no nonsense, the kind of woman who had seen every excuse imaginable and liked none of them. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room like a hawk preparing to land. Sophie's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client and her husband are concerned about Mrs. Manning's safety and well-being. There have been multiple instances of forgetfulness, possible physical instability, and—" "She spilled tea," Sophie interjected with a practiced tremble, "all over the floor, then nearly slipped trying to clean it up. She shakes constantly." Dolores didn't move. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. But Harold opened the briefcase. He pulled out a binder, thick, color-coded, and tabbed. "We submit Exhibit A," he said, "which includes Mrs. Manning's daily logs of household activities, medication tracking, full financial records, all neatly kept and accurate, and a certified letter from her primary care physician." He handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Judge Duval opened it, read, raised a brow. "In addition," Harold continued, "we have a statement confirming no signs of cognitive decline. Mrs. Manning is competent, physically capable, and if I may say so, sharper than most of us in this room." Tamara was next. "Tell the court how you know Mrs. Manning," the judge requested. Tamara stood, voice steady and southern clear. "She's my best friend. Has been for 40 years. We garden. Together. She bakes, she budgets, she runs circles around me. And she walked herself into my home last week because someone in hers hit her with a broom." Murmurs fluttered through the courtroom. Sophie flinched. Kyle shifted in his seat. Judge Duval looked up. "Is that allegation supported?" Dolores finally spoke, her voice soft but anchored. "It is." She stood, slow, deliberate. Then she reached down and picked up something long, thin, and unexpected from beside her chair. A broom. She walked to the center of the courtroom, with it in hand. "This," she said calmly, "is what she used." Gasps. Not loud, but enough. Dolores laid it on the evidence table. I labeled it Exhibit B. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do you have photographic evidence?" Harold stepped forward again. "Yes, Your Honor. Dated photos of the injury, medical documentation, entries from Mrs. Manning's personal journal." Dolores looked directly at Kyle. "You were there. You saw it." Kyle didn't speak, didn't even blink. And you, she added, turning to Sophie, called it just a little discipline. Sophie scoffed, standing too quickly. She's exaggerating. That thing barely. Judge Duval held up a hand. Mrs. Manning, return to your seat. Dolores obeyed without hesitation, her back straight, her face unreadable. The judge reviewed the papers in silence. Then she set them down and looked at Sophie. Let me be perfectly clear. This courtroom does not entertain elder exploitation disguised as concern. I find your petition premature at best, malicious at worst. She folded her hands, gaze fixed on Sophie. We're not done, not by a long shot. As Sophie sank back into her chair, visibly rattled, Dolores leaned slightly toward Harold and whispered, You brought the law. I brought the truth. Harold didn't smile, but he nodded once. As Judge Duval scheduled the next hearing, she glanced toward the broom on the table, and then toward Dolores. Mrs. Manning, she said, you'll have the floor next. Be ready. And Dolores simply replied, I've been ready for a long time. Dolores Manning adjusted the microphone, her fingers steady despite the chill in the courtroom. The wood-paneled walls pressed inward, heavy with silence. Her posture was straight, chin slightly lifted. She wore a pearl brooch shaped like a magnolia blossom, a quiet nod to resilience. Mrs. Manning, Judge Duval said from the bench, you may begin. Dolores didn't glance at Sophie or Kyle. Her gaze was fixed just above the judge's head, as if staring into something invisible but immense. It started with tea, she said softly. Hot afternoon. I offered her a cup, like I've done 100 times. My hand trembled. A few drops hit the tile. She reached to the evidence table beside her and picked up the broom, the same one she'd brought last hearing, now tagged. Labeled neatly in Harold's meticulous handwriting, Exhibit A. She hit me with this, Dolores continued, holding it up for the gallery and jury box. Across the back, twice, whispers erupted. The bailiff held up a hand for quiet. She said I needed to learn to be careful, called me a clumsy old woman. Dolores set the broom down slowly, the bristles brushing the tabletop, with a soft hiss. Harold handed her a folder. Dolores opened it and pulled out 3 photographs. She held them up one at a time. The first, a dark bruise shaped like a crescent on her lower back. The second, her medical report, signed and dated. The third, her own handwritten journal entry. The ink pressed deep into the page. The words, hit me with a broom. Kyle watched, said nothing. Gasps again. Sophie crossed her arms tightly. Kyle shifted, his jaw clenched but still silent. I've cooked for this family since before Sophie even learned to boil rice, Dolores went on. I paid off that house. I taught my son kindness. And I was treated like a stray dog who spilled something on the carpet. Judge Duval leaned forward slightly. Did your son intervene? Dolores didn't blink. He took the broom to the curb the next morning, like that would erase what she did. A long pause filled the room. Then, Your Honor, Harold said, standing, we request the immediate denial of the power of attorney petition on the grounds of bad faith and potential abuse, and we request the court initiate a formal counter-investigation. The judge looked at Sophie. Sophie's face was drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Mrs. Manning, the judge said slowly, you've presented compelling evidence. Unless the petitioners have a rebuttal. Kyle didn't move. Sophie gripped the table, her knuckles white. The judge nodded once. Petition denied, effective immediately, and I am ordering a preliminary inquiry into potential financial and physical abuse. This court takes elder mistreatment very seriously. The gavel cracked against wood like a thunderclap. Dolores exhaled quietly, not relief, not triumph. Something quieter, something earned. She rose, gathered her folder and the broom, and turned to face them both, her son, his wife. We're done here, she said, not loud, not sharp, just final. Kyle looked away. Sophie blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears, or fury, or both. Dolores walked out, back straight, shoulders square. Harold followed. Tamara stood just outside the doors, arms folded, waiting like the loyal shadow she'd always been. Outside the courtroom, the sun felt different, brighter somehow, warmer. But that warmth didn't follow Sophie home. Because later that afternoon, when Sophie went to check the shared bank account, the screen flashed, access denied. And when she turned her key in Dolores' front door out of habit, it stuck, refused, and clicked solid from the inside. Not a crack of daylight for her to peek through. Just a door. Locked. The locksmith worked quickly, his gloves creaking softly as he turned the final screw on the new deadbolt. Dolores watched from her porch rocker, a glass of sweet tea sweating in her hand, the condensation mirroring the calm forming behind her eyes. She had spent a lifetime opening doors. To guests, to family, to forgiveness. But that morning she decided. Some doors stayed shut. Harold stood just behind her, files tucked neatly under his arm. Full title lock, he confirmed. The house, the land, the trust assets, all secured. No one touches a dime unless you say so. He smiled, then added, or unless they want to test the new restraining clause. Dolores nodded slowly. Good. From down the sidewalk, the sharp click of Sophie's heels broke the quiet. The click turned to a thud as she stopped short at the gate, yanked the latch, and found it wouldn't budge. She tried her key next, jabbing it angrily into the front door's lock. Nothing. Dolores stood and walked to the edge of the porch, planting herself like an oak in bloom. Looking for this? She asked, holding up an old brass key before dropping it into a metal tin labeled Scraps. Sophie's nostrils flared. What is this? This, Dolores said, voice low but steady, is private property now, and you're trespassing. Sophie stepped back, blinking as though slapped. You're being ridiculous. Number I was ridiculous for letting you stay in my home after you raised your hand to me, Dolores replied. Now I'm just being smart. Tamara, crouched in her garden beside the porch, didn't even glance up. She clipped a blooming hydrangea with a tiny snip, dropped it into a ceramic vase, and said under her breath, smells like freedom. You can't do this, Sophie snapped, her voice pitching higher. We were trying to help you. Dolores stepped down one stair, unfolding a folded envelope from her apron. This is a no-contact order, signed and served. Step 1 foot closer, and the police will be here before your mascara melts. A few neighbors had already paused on their porches. One raised an eyebrow. Another sipped coffee without shame. Word in Savannah spread faster than pollen in summer. I swear you're out of your mind, Sophie hissed. I've been out of your reach, and that's what's bothering you. With a final scream, sharp, shrill, cracked at the edges, Sophie stormed off, her heels clacking like gavel strikes. But before she reached the sidewalk, her voice caught. This isn't over! Dolores returned to her rocker. Oh, sweetheart, she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. It was over the day you raised that broom. Tamara laughed, a low, slow wheeze of approval. You want lemon balm in your tea? Please, Dolores said, exhaling. The screen door creaked behind her as she stepped back into her home, the new lock clicking firmly shut. By sundown, the story was out. The Savannah Chronicle ran a sidebar under its community justice section. Local matriarch secures assets after alleged elder abuse. Courtroom broom now symbol of courage. Beneath it, a photo captured Dolores standing on her porch with arms gently folded, eyes clear and steady while Sophie was mid-yell beyond the gate. The image was cropped tight, but the tension spilled off the page like steam from a boiling pot. Tamara dropped the newspaper on the kitchen table with a satisfied thump. You, my dear, just went full Georgia thunderstorm. Quiet till you weren't, and then nothing left standing. Dolores said nothing at first. She stared at the picture, fingers brushing the rim of her teacup. There was no joy in seeing Sophie's rage frozen like that, but there was something else. Closure, maybe, or the slow burn of a truth finally stepping into daylight. Across town, Sophie's curated little world began to unravel. Her Instagram boutique, lace aprons, and pastel teacups lost over 100 followers overnight. A vendor canceled a wholesale order. A longtime sponsor emailed requesting to pause all collaborations pending clarification. That morning, she'd filmed a tearful story claiming family misunderstandings had been twisted. But the comments didn't offer sympathy. They wanted accountability. Meanwhile, Kyle's office called him in. The HR director's voice was syrupy but sharp. Given the visibility of the case and your proximity, we think a leave of absence would be appropriate. Paid, of course, for now. He nodded mutely, pocketing his ID badge without argument. He'd said little during the courtroom storm. Now, silence was all he had left. Dolores, however, wasn't finished writing chapters. That afternoon, she opened the front door to find a florist on the porch. A bouquet of pale yellow roses stood in a mason jar, tied with a gingham ribbon. Tucked inside was a card. You taught me how to make cornbread and courage. In that order, thank you. April B. Dolores's breath caught. April had been a student in her home ec class 20 years ago, back when Dolores still wore pearls to school and believed respect was something you earned, not begged for. She remembered April's shy hands fumbling with biscuit dough, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. She never expected her students remembered her name, let alone her spirit. Later that evening, Harold called. His voice, though measured as ever, carried warmth. Thought you'd like to know. The scholarship fund received its first official applicant today. A young woman named Inez, single mother, wants to attend the culinary program at Savannah Tech. Dolores swallowed. Is she good? She attached a photo of her cornbread, Harold replied, chuckling. Let's just say you'd approve. Tamara arrived just before dusk, a tin of peach cobbler in hand, the crust perfectly golden. She set it down with a smirk. You didn't just get even, Del. You got free. That's rarer. Dolores poured 2 glasses of sweet tea. I didn't want revenge, she said. Just respect. And room to breathe. And now you've got both, Tamara said. Plus pie. The 2 women sat on the porch as cicadas buzzed in the distance and twilight softened the edges of the day. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, and wind danced through the hydrangeas. Dolores's peace was short-lived, though. The next morning, Sophie sends a letter to Dolores. The envelope was off-white and thick, the kind Dolores used to buy for thank-you notes. Her name was inked across the front in Sophie's narrow, practiced handwriting. Too neat to be sincere. She held it for a moment, thumb grazing the edge, before opening it slowly, like peeling back old wallpaper she knew would reveal mold. The letter inside smelled faintly of perfume. Something floral, trying too hard. Dolores, it began. I've been reflecting a lot these past weeks. I was stressed, overwhelmed, hormonal. And I know I didn't treat you right. But families have rough patches, right? We miss you. Please consider coming by for supper. Let's start over. It was signed, with love, Sophie Hart. A heart, drawn like a teenager asking to be believed. Dolores sat back in her porch chair, letter limp in her lap, the words ringing in her ears like a cracked wind chime. There were no specifics. No mention of the broom. No mention of the bruise. No mention of the money. Just vague regrets and a plea for a reset. As if time and scorched tea stains could be scrubbed out of memory like smudges on glass. She looked out over the yard, where Tamara's hydrangeas bloomed proudly by the fence. The wind was still, the air thick with summer heat, cicadas humming their endless refrain. Without a word, Dolores stood up, walked down the porch steps, and made her way to the old brick fire pit near the back garden. It still smelled faintly of pecan wood from last winter's cookout. She set the letter in the pit, struck a match, watched the paper curl, blacken, and vanish in orange flame. That's the only warmth she'll get from me, Dolores said aloud, voice calm, final. The next day, Harold arrived with the finalized estate documents, crisp and notarized. Everything Sophie and Kyle once held claim to had been dissolved, redirected, and legally locked behind layers of ironclad clauses. The trust for the culinary school was in place. The house deeds solely in Dolores's name. All assets, liquid or otherwise, untouchable to anyone who treated her as disposable. Harold handed her a pen. Initial here and here. Dolores signed with steady hands. "How's that for shaky?" she muttered, a wry smile creeping in. He raised an eyebrow. "That myth didn't last long, did it?" she chuckled. "Neither did their grip." After Harold left, Dolores sat at her kitchen table, a glass of iced tea sweating beside her. She opened her personal file, a plain manila folder, and slipped the newly finalized documents behind a typed sheet she'd been editing quietly over the last week. It was her obituary draft. The top read, "Dolores Manning, preceded in legacy by her dignity." Below, that were a few lines about her catering career, her scholarship fund, and a quote she'd chosen from her late husband's journal. "You don't build a legacy with bricks, but with backbone." Later that evening, Tamara dropped by, wearing a lime green sundress and carrying a mason jar of peach iced tea. She saw the smirk on Dolores's face and squinted. "You look like a woman who's just signed off on her final chapter." "I have," Dolores said, tapping the folder. Tamara peered over her shoulder, read the top line, and let out a bark of laughter. "That's Southern steel sugar, iron in the spine and lace on the sleeves." They clinked tea jars and sat in the porch rockers, letting the evening settle in. Fireflies blinked lazily across the lawn. Somewhere a neighbor's radio played soft blues. The world, for once, felt still, not empty, but at peace. As the last orange hues of the day melted into dusk, Dolores's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the culinary school administrator. "We'd like to honor the new scholarship with a plaque. May we use your full name, Ms. Manning?" Dolores smiled, soft, proud, and looked up at the sky, already thinking of how it would read. Dolores adjusted the pearl clip in her silver-streaked hair as the principal of the Savannah Trade School took the podium. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the banquet hall, illuminating white tablecloths, glinting off silverware, and catching the golden shimmer of a plaque veiled in velvet behind the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," the principal began, her voice warm and reverent, "today we are proud to inaugurate a scholarship that reflects not just culinary excellence, but resilience, dignity, and the quiet force of grace under pressure." Dolores's hands rested lightly in her lap. She could still smell the faint hint of lavender on the dress she'd ironed that morning. She hadn't worn heels in over a year, but she had for this. A day that didn't belong to Sophie or Kyle, or the years she gave them. It belonged to what came after. The velvet was pulled, and there it was. The Dolores Manning Culinary Award, etched into polished brass above a line that read, "For those who feed with both hands and heart." The applause started slowly, but then it built, echoing off the walls like applause at a homecoming. Dolores stood, unsure at first whether she was supposed to say something, until the principal gently nudged her forward with a whisper. "They're clapping for you, take your moment." She stepped up to the mic, cleared her throat. "I didn't build a fortune," she said plainly, "but I built meals, and they fed more than mouths. They fed memories. My kitchen was my altar, my spoons, my scepter." A few chuckles fluttered from the crowd. "I had my name worn down in places it didn't belong, misused, misquoted, and mistreated. But today," her voice held firm, steady as stone, "I'm putting it where it will do the most good, in the hands of someone who knows what it means to be hungry, and what it takes to feed others anyway." At that, the first scholarship recipient was introduced, a young woman named Lana, 27, a single mother of two, once homeless, now enrolled full-time in the school's culinary arts program. Her hands trembled as she accepted the award. When they embraced, Lana whispered, "I won't waste it." I swear Dolores smiled. "Just don't forget the salt, sugar, or soul." Later, a local reporter approached with a small voice recorder. Ms. Manning, do you have any words about what legacy means to you? Dolores paused, glanced toward the buffet where they were serving her mother's gumbo recipe, and said, "Legacy is cooked slowly, served hot, and never thrown out." The quote ran in the Savannah Press the next morning, alongside a photograph of Dolores in a sea blue dress, standing tall beside Lana, framed plaque in the background. But it was the photo in her own house that meant more. Inside her entryway, above the wooden bench where visitors left their umbrellas, hung a simple black and white print. A photo of the broom, the very one Sophie had used against her, resting on a kitchen wall hook. Underneath, a brass plate read, "Retired." Tamara had insisted on framing it. A reminder, she'd said, that sometimes what's meant to hurt you ends up hanging limp on your wall. Harmless, forgotten, and irrelevant. Dolores passed it that evening, mail in hand, humming as she opened the envelope at the top of the stack. She expected another thank you note or school update, but the bolded return address stopped her breath mid-hum. Chatham County Probate Court. She unfolded the pages, each line typed with the sterile precision of legal formality. At the bottom, scrawled in ink, Petitioner Kyle Manning. Matter, challenge to will and testament of Dolores Manning. Basis, undue influence, mental decline, claim. Dolores blinked once, then twice. The porch light flickered behind her as the Georgia dusk settled in like a low hum. Her hand clenched slightly, paper crinkling under her grip. From the kitchen, Tamara called out, "Everything all right, sugar?" Dolores's voice was quiet, steel wrapped in velvet. He just signed his last mistake. The courtroom sat in a tense hush, thick as southern heat before a storm. Kyle Manning stood at the plaintiff's table in a too-tight suit, his tie crooked, hands fidgeting like a boy caught in a lie he couldn't spin his way out of. Beside him, Sophie sat stiffly, arms crossed, her face a cocktail of practiced innocence and seething resentment. Judge Arliss Duval scanned the documents one last time, his reading glasses low on his nose. His gavel rested untouched. The silence stretched until it became a presence in the room. "Mr. Manning," Judge Duval finally said, voice cool as iced sweet tea. "You filed a petition contesting your mother's will, alleging undue influence and cognitive decline. Your supporting evidence is sparse at best." Kyle cleared his throat, trying to find his father's old steel in a voice that had always bent like willow. "She's not herself anymore, Your Honor. She's isolated." Tamara Sloan is whispering in her ear, "My mother's mind isn't sharp like it used to be." And yet, Duval interrupted, raising an eyebrow, she managed to establish a scholarship fund, coordinate legal filings across 3 trusts, and submit notarized evaluations from 2 independent physicians. His fingers tapped the bench lightly. "Your mother is not only competent, she's meticulous." The gallery stirred. In the 3rd row, Harold Stokes sat with an arm draped over the back of the pew, calm and unreadable. He didn't need to speak. The paperwork had already done the talking. And the ruling, Duval leaned forward. "I reviewed the abuse claims. I reviewed the medical records. I reviewed your own financial history." He paused. "Sophie Manning, you accessed joint funds without Dolores Manning's consent. You failed to report assets during a prior inquiry, and most critically," he tapped a document, "you are documented as having physically struck her, not once, repeatedly." Sophie's mouth opened, closed. No words came out. "This court finds your challenge baseless. Your inheritance rights are permanently revoked," Judge Duval said sharply. "Mr. Manning, you may have been complicit by silence, but silence, in this case, is cruelty." He raised the gavel. "You will not profit from mistreatment." The wood struck the sound block like thunder. Kyle's shoulders sagged, defeat finally settling in his spine. Sophie stood abruptly, heels clacking on the marble floor, her expression blank as she stormed out. The courtroom door swung open, let in the brief cry of cicadas from outside, and then slammed shut. but Dolores wasn't there to see it. Miles away, in the warm, humming kitchen of the community center, she slid a peach cobbler into the oven. Her apron bore light smudges of flour, and the air was thick with the smell of brown sugar and cinnamon. Children laughed outside the window. Tamara stirred lemonade in a pitcher by the counter. "You sure you don't want to call Harold?" Tamara asked, tilting her head. Dolores glanced at the old wall clock. "He'll call when it's done." As if summoned, her cell phone buzzed. One new text from Harold. She didn't need to read more than the preview. Final ruling, airtight. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and let out a long, quiet breath. Not relief, resolve. Like closing a door that had been creaking on its hinges too long. Later that evening, Melody, Tamara's bright-eyed niece, home from grad school, stopped by. She carried a foil-covered plate of baked macaroni, but it was the envelope in her other hand that caught Dolores's eye. "Thought you might want this," Melody said, handing it over. The school sent extra photos from the luncheon. Dolores smiled and tucked the envelope into the corner of her scrapbook, flipping back a few pages. There were clipped headlines, scholarship acceptance letters, thank you notes, and the plaque unveiling. But it was the last page she focused on. At the top, in crisp, careful lettering, a title. "The Family I Chose." Beneath it, a photo of her Sunday supper table, full of neighbors, students, and friends. Tamara mid-laugh, Melody grinning. A child with gap teeth holding a biscuit, high like a trophy. Dolores pressed the page flat, gently smoothed the corners, and closed the book with a contented snap. And in the quiet that followed, not once did she think of Kyle. The scent of cornbread and braised collard greens curled through Dolores Manning's house like memory made warm. The table was covered in buttered dishes and passing hands, laughter bouncing off the walls as if the house itself had finally exhaled. Glasses clinked. Someone dropped a spoon. No one flinched. Dolores stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, apron still tied at her waist, holding a bowl of stewed okra and tomatoes. Her gaze swept the room like a quiet guard, not to check for trouble, but to witness peace. Melody was laughing with two culinary students, one of whom had just been accepted to the trade school on Dolores's scholarship. Tamara was already halfway through her second slice of chess pie, fanning herself with a folded napkin. "Now this," Tamara called from across the table, "is what Sundays were made for." Dolores smiled and carried the bowl to the table, sliding it between the skillet fried chicken and a sweet potato casserole that had earned a hum of approval from nearly every guest. Her house had changed, not in size or structure, but in spirit. The walls didn't carry tension anymore. There were no eyes watching from across the kitchen, no heavy silences between footsteps. There was only the rhythm of stories told over full plates, joy that didn't ask permission. A framed photograph sat above the fireplace, her late husband in his Sunday suit, one arm slung around Dolores at a long-ago barbecue. Just beside it, in an identical frame, was her finalized will. Beneath the elegant calligraphy, two names were missing. There were no gaps where Kyle and Sophie used to be. The lines had been rewritten, not erased. The legacy had simply been corrected. "Miss Dolores," one of the students asked gently between bites, "if you don't mind me asking, do you ever hear from your son? Or his wife?" The room hushed slightly, like even the air leaned closer. Dolores looked up slowly, the silver spoon pausing above her plate. For a beat, all anyone could hear was the clock ticking above the mantel and the muffled chirp of cicadas outside the screen door. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin, then folded it with care. "No," she said, voice smooth as a still pond. "I hear peace instead." There was a flicker of reaction from around the table. Smiles shared, glances exchanged. Not a single soul pressed her further. The evening slipped on like a silk scarf. Plates emptied. Second helpings were had. Melody helped Dolores pack leftovers into containers labeled in her tidy handwriting. A student asked for her pecan pie recipe. Tamara handed out Tupperware like party favors. Later, when the last hug had been exchanged and the porch light flicked on, Dolores settled into her reading chair. The breeze slid in through the cracked window, soft and citrus sweet from the garden outside. She pulled a well-worn notebook from the drawer, the same one she'd used to record bruises, bank statements, dates, and receipts. Now, its final pages held copies of the scholarship paperwork, notes from grateful recipients, a news clipping from the Savannah Morning Times, and a printout of the culinary school's plaque unveiling, the Dolores Manning Culinary Award, in honor of resilience, flavor, and chosen family. Dolores flipped to the last blank page. She wrote only one sentence. The best meals are served without bitterness. Then she closed the notebook for the last time, pressing her hand gently over the cover like sealing a chapter. Outside, the wind rattled the azalea bush against the window. Inside, all was still. She turned off the lamp and stood, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath her steps the only sound. As she passed the hallway, her eyes briefly met the photograph of her husband again. She nodded once, and on the other side of the frame, the will remained unchanged, clear, signed, and sealed. No Sophie, no Kyle, no apologies, no weight, just a clean name, a clean legacy. My son's wife hit me with a broom for spilling tea, so I spilled her name out of my will.